Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to yet another episode of Strange Playgrounds. This is completely spontaneous. I was just sitting here doing a little bit of writing, a little bit of editing, a little bit of this and that, and I happened to spy one of the many. I don't just have one to read pile. I've got like multiple to read piles that are scattered around the house in various locations, and I tend to pick at them in a kind of scavenging kind of way. So when something catches my eye, I will just pick up the book and start reading it again. And that's kind of the way I work. I have this kind of magpie approach to reading these days. And that's because I think that's come about because there's so much to read. There's so much. I mean, I know there's a lot of contention in the nature of publishing and the nature of publishing fiction, hard copies of fiction at the moment. The market is in a very strange place. The industry of publication is in a very strange place thanks to lots of upheavals of late. Lots of things like, for example, the efflorescence of small press and independent publishing has changed the landscape completely. The gradual self-strangulation of the established publishing houses as they continue to publish endless reams of populist shit rather than stuff that's challenging and interesting. The shift of the onus, the coalescence of cultures around the independent market and the small press market, the self-publishing market, is amazing. It's absolutely incredible. I mean, don't get me wrong, it also means that obviously a lot of shit gets published and a lot of shit gets popular. Popularity is actually no indication of the quality of work. It really isn't. And we know that. We know that because look at the way celebrity, purportedly celebrity authored, but which are actually ghost authored works sell. They're all shit. Anything that's got a celebrity's name on it that's purportedly authored by some actor or comedian or whatever is generally going to be a pile of shit. Not universally, but generally going to be a pile of shit. And they are not written by the people whose names are on them. This is one of the unspoken secrets of the industry. They're not authored by the people who proclaim to write them. They're just not. They're ghost authored, and then the celebrity's name is used to sell them. Generally, wankery, absolute utter wankery from people who have nothing to say on any particular or given issue. Not universally, but generally speaking. There are exceptions I can think of, like for example a science fiction work written by Charlie Brooker would probably be fantastic because he knows whereof he speaks. A horror novel written by Matthew Holness would probably be fantastic because he knows whereof he speaks. But they are rare. The ones who can actually do it and do it themselves are rare. For the most part they are lamentable tosh, but they sell like the gangbusters because they have a particular name attached to them. But that's not really, that isn't a moan that I came here to talk about, really. The current situation is really fascinating because there are so many voices out there and so many different works to consume. Across the board, from mainstream publishing to independent to small press to self-publication. It means that we're spoiled for choice. It means that there is a glut of stuff, and there are so many works out there by so many people that I want to read, that I just haven't got round to yet, that are just piling up here from people I know, people I've met and interacted with, that I just really, really want to get to grips with. And as a result of that, I don't so much have a to read me pile as a to read me Smaug's treasure hoard. It's that kind of thing. It's like mountains and hillocks of work, and that goes double for my bloody Kindle. Again, there's kind of a contention. There is a kind of traditionalist conflict with digital media. I like digital media myself. I actually find it freeing. It means that I don't have to carry around books with me wherever I go, which is something I used to do. And when I say wherever I go, I mean wherever I go. I was never without a little plastic bag or book or backpack full of books wherever I went. That's just the way I am. I need a book with me. It's almost like a security blanket thing. I need a book with me all the time. But I don't need to do that anymore because all my Kindle is on my phone, and my Kindle is just full. It's just full of... It's bigger than my physical library now. It's just full of everything. I've got works on there by Dostoevsky. I've got the collected works of Dostoevsky and Dickens and Shakespeare and everyone. Ursula K. Le Guin, Lovecraft, all of this stuff is on there. Philip K. Dick, and I can just dive in whenever I want, and that is wonderful. That is absolutely wonderful. The problem with that is that there's just so much. You are spoiled for choice. So I really need to sort of focus down and start reading a bit more concertedly. I think. I mean, I read every day, that's not like it is habitual, but it's not like a thing that I excoriate myself for. It's something I do because I want to do. Reading for me is a joy. It's a sincere joy. It's an escape. It's a release valve. It comforts me. It makes me feel contained and is a sort of seclusion away from the waking world, even though, as we've discussed many times before, no fiction is really escapist. It's kind of a misnomer. It's a window for confronting reality from a sort of weird angle, from a non-specific angle. But it is something that I enjoy. It's something I've always enjoyed and will enjoy up until the day I can't do it anymore, which will probably be the day that I'm dead, whenever that happens to occur. But yes, as a result, there's just loads of stuff. I've got here sat next to me on my sofa where I'm recording this, just a random book. There's a biography of Andreas Vesalius, which I've started, The Making the Madman and the Myth by Stephen N. Joff. And this is fantastic. I really, really like... I don't like celebrity biographies. I'm not interested in them. By and large, I find them rather dull. I find them hagiographic, and they tend to lionize the individual in a way that I don't like. But I do like historical biographies written by actual historians who are only interested in, not in lionizing the individual, but exploring who they are and what their lives are. I read a very good one of Dante a little while back, and that was bloody fascinating. I mean, I love Dante's poetry. I love the Divine Comedy. I love the Inferno. I think those are fantastic pieces of work, and I take a lot of inspiration from them. As anyone who reads my fiction will know, there are touchstones all the way through to the Divine Comedy. I think they are absolutely beautiful, but when you read a biography of Dante, it gives you all of this context for what he's actually talking about. I mean, there is a tendency to take the Divine Comedy in a very literalist way in many respects, that when he's describing the various torments in hell and the various circles and levels of hell, that he's describing what he literally believes, or that it's literally a religious or metaphysical exploration. It is that, but there's also other stuff as well. There's a lot of political satire in there. There's a lot of personal satire. A lot of the people who are condemned to the various different hells are people that he knows and doesn't like. You need to understand things about his life in order to understand what he was writing about. Andreas Vesalius, I've come across many times before. I first came across him as a result of Kel Surprise, Clive Barker. Clive Barker is a big fan of Andreas Vesalius. Andreas Vesalius was a 16th century Florentine who was also... He is an anatomist and a surgeon. He's one of the key figures in the development of what is considered present-day anatomy, anatomical understanding. He did things and recorded things that no one before him had ever done. He basically mapped out the human body. He created these wonderful sketches and diagnostics of the human body, which determined things like nerve structure, cranial structure, organ structure, the function and structure of the muscular system in relation to the skeletal system, stuff that no one had ever done before. And anyone who's who's a fan of Clive Barker will actually kind of know his work by proxy, because Barker actually recreates a lot of his work in his work. So if you take Hellraiser, for example, the image of Skinless Frank in Hellraiser derives from Vesalius' sketches. Vesalius did these wonderful anatomical sketches of skinless human beings in various very casual situations and poses, which were designed to show anatomists the way musculature works and anatomy works in various states of stress or repose or in just general function. And they are so detailed and so beautiful. And it's amazing to read about the man's life, because he was around in Florence, but in Europe in general, he travelled all over the place. Not only learning, but also teaching and getting involved in battles. Like, a lot of his anatomy was learnt on the battlefield. He was a battlefield surgeon at one time. And changing the face of what was considered medical understanding and medical orthodoxy of the time. He actually got into a lot of trouble. He made a lot of enemies because he challenged the medical orthodoxy of the era. Just fascinating. Absolutely. I love stuff like this. I really do. I mean, I am primarily a reader of fiction. I like narrative. But I also like the narrative of history. I really, 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 really love to read about eras that are gone by where the meta narratives of culture and society are different, where people are operating in relation to different cultural assumptions and traditions. That absolutely fascinates me, and that's a beautiful thing. And underneath that, we've got something that's kind of related but kind of not, which is Traumas, which is a book of body horror by Paul Kane. I love body horror. I've got such an adoration for body horror. I find it aesthetically fascinating, the elaboration of imagination that comes about with body horror. I think much of it derives from my love of Cronenberg and works like John Carpenter's The Thing. There's something about not just the mutilation of the human body or the corruption of the human body, although that is part and parcel of the themes of body horror, but the transformation of it. The notion of the human body as pupating or metamorphic, as something that can transform when exposed to certain things and certain pressures, I find to be absolutely fascinating. And that is something that is very popular within horror. It recurs in horror again and again and again and again. But what I like about it in horror is that it's not always universally negative. Like in Cronenberg's works, body horror always comes with this weird little caveat where it's almost welcomed. If you watch Videodrome, for example, the whole celebration of the new flesh which is sculpted, which is metamorphic, which you can actually transform and change, is amazing. It's the same in things like Shivers, even in The Fly, which is probably one of the less ambiguous of his works, because it refers to lots of cultural narratives that were occurring at the time. So it's a story about escalating cultural awareness of things like cancer, of the AIDS epidemic, that kind of thing. All of that imagery is in there. But at the same time, there is a celebratory aspect. I mean, certainly early on, when Brundle is realizing his new capacities in this new state, whereby he's much stronger, he's faster, he can cling to walls and stuff like that, the transcendence of humanity is something that fascinates me. It's something that fascinates me in body horror as much as it does in like transhumanist fiction, like in cyberpunk fiction, in science fiction, where it often has much more of a hopeful vein about it, much more of a utopian edge. But yeah, that's something I'm getting my teeth into at the moment. Big fan of Paul Kane, love Paul Kane stuff. Like myself, he's massively inspired by Clive Barker, and unlike myself, has actually had the fortune to meet the man and to interact with him. And Paul, honestly, man, I am so jealous. I am so jealous. I mean, I don't think I'd be able to do it. I think I'd go a bit wibbly if I had to interact with Clive Barker, to be perfectly honest. But there we are. other stuff that I've got going on at the moment, a huge stack of Warhammer fiction. Huge stack of stuff from the Black Library. Mostly Warhammer 40,000. I'm a big fan. I love that stuff. It's pulpy, it's popcorn, but a lot of the time, there's a lot of writers now in Warhammer, from the Black Library, getting published now who actually transcend those parameters and write really genuinely brilliant horror, crime, and psychological fiction as well, and science fiction, obviously. The one I'm reading at the moment is a book by Guy Haley called Konrad CURZE. It is about the Primarch of the Night Lords, and he's well, it's a deep cut psychological study of Konrad CURZE, and that makes it a work of absolute horror, because Konrad CURZE is like the ultimate super sadist. He's a pure psychopath in the very literal terms, not in the colloquial sense, but in like the literal sense, but is also a superhuman entity that, you know, is almost immortal, super strong, super fast, more or less cannot be killed. So he's free to express his sadism to its fullest extent and to explore it in a way without parameters, without any kind of threat acting upon him to limit his exploration. So you can actually imagine the kind of imagery that you get in this book, and it is really fascinating. I'm really enjoying it. Reread The Lords of Silence recently by WRAIGHT, and The Lords of Silence is another Warhammer book which explores a splinter vectorium of the Death Guard, the legion dedicated to Nurgle, the god of plagues and disease. And that's really fascinating. It is really, really fascinating because it takes a deep dive into the psychology of the Plague Marine. So these entities, these creatures that are perpetually diseased and rotting and cancerous and in perpetual pain and agony and despair. It goes deep into what it's like to operate at those extremes all the time and yet have no relief from them. No chance of death, no chance of escaping from this condition. It's a really hard thing to write. It's a very difficult thing to write because it's a difficult thing to imagine. Where does the mind go when it's operating at that state of extreme all the time, when there are literally supernatural forces acting upon it? But he does it beautifully. He really does. He really characterizes these extreme entities in a beautiful, beautiful way. One of the more interesting elements of it is that although there's the usual what's called the bolter porn, which is the war stuff, where it's battle, it emulates the battles of the actual war game, the miniatures war game, Warhammer 40,000, where it's one side against another, and it's carnage, and it's violence, and it's just loads of popcorn science fiction fun. You've got that element, but there's also these wonderful quiet moments where it's just the followers of Nurgle, or those who have been taken by them, experiencing what it's like to be in that condition, and that's wonderful. I really, really love it. It's a brilliant and beautiful piece of work, and I highly, highly recommend it. Again, kind of an example of the capacity for, or the potential for, horror in these universes. Kind of wonderful. At the moment, I am currently partway through rereading Titus Alone, which is the third Gormenghast book. I took a break after finishing the first two, which my reading of those this time round, this is like the third or fourth time I've read them, was very profound, very profound. There's something about the state of Gormenghast that, despite it being quite an old book now, or an old series of books, that echoes our current climate and culture. There is a universality to it, in the same way there's a universality to a lot of dystopian fiction, which in a way it is. Gormenghast is a kind of wry satire on the nature of tradition and the systems of society, and the assumptions that inform that, particularly British society and British history. And there's something about the conclusions and the ethos of Gormenghast that have very, very, very particular resonance now. If there were like a new film or series of Gormenghast, like a Netflix series or something like that, I think it would go down gangbusters because it is so culturally relevant. It's so resonant. But I'm reading the third book in the series, Titus Alone, and the third book is really strange. It is kind of the red-headed stepchild of that series because Mervyn Peake wrote it in a very different frame of mind. Mervyn Peake suffered with a degenerative neurological condition, which meant towards the end of his life, he actually did lose his sanity. He lost his mind and became massively dislocated from himself, from his sense of self, became incredibly paranoid, didn't know who he was, where he was, who his family were. And he is writing Titus Alone in the midst of that degeneration. It's a really fascinating dynamic. So you actually have on the page the experience of a mind devouring itself, and it's reflected in the state of the protagonist Titus, who is from the previous books, the renegade prince of Gormenghast, if you like, who escaped from Gormenghast and went out into the world. Here in Titus Alone, he's in a very different world, It's a modernist world, as opposed to the sort of slightly medieval world of Gormenghast. It's a modernist world with industry and with a cultural and societal structure that's more redolent of modernism. And Titus is this out-of-place entity who doesn't know where he is, doesn't really know who he is, and to whom people respond in a very peculiar way. There is the implication that Gormenghast doesn't exist and never existed, and that everything he experienced in the previous two books are actually hallucinations or delusions. Titus is in this fevered condition all the way through this book, or echoing Mervyn Peake himself, whereby he just doesn't know where he is or what he's doing. He's dislocated, he's uncertain of his own past, of his own mind, and he's feverishly scrabbling to get back what he feverishly sought to escape from in the previous books, just to ratify to himself that it exists and his history in his memory is correct. It's a really disturbing, strange, brilliant piece of work. I'm really enjoying it this time round. The first time round I did enjoy it, but I was in a very bad place. I was, like, literally, I was in Marrakesh and I'd caught some awful bug, and I was like in a fever. It was a really weird state to read Titus Alone in. But yeah, it's fascinating. I'm really enjoying it. On the horizon, I've got so much to read. There's the Lovecraft collection that I really want to get through. I haven't read Lovecraft stuff for a long time. Partway through rereading Cold Heart Canyon by Clive Barker, which fans of this channel have heard me talk about many, many times, particularly in the Barker retrospective that relates to it. Fascinating. I mean, really, really fast. As always, know that book inside out. I know it inside out. I could probably quote big chunks of it at you. But it's Barker's satire of Hollywood, essentially. It's Barker's satire of Hollywood. He is taking the myth of Hollywood and the myths upon which it operates and deconstructing them in an excoriating fashion. I mean, he is basically raking the muck. He is going deep into the actual history of Hollywood, the abuses, the sadism, the unspoken filth of it, and raking it and dragging it back to the surface. It's fascinating stuff. It really is. And it's probably Barker's most vituperative book. It's his most venomous book. It's one where he has an agenda and a target, and he's going after it. He's going after it without ambiguity, you know? He doesn't write books in anger. Barker doesn't. Not often. There are things in his books that he's angry about. That's for damn sure. But he doesn't tend to write whole books spurred by an anger-driven agenda. But here, that's exactly what you've got. It's Barker at his angriest. And just taking joy in raking up the filth. You know, just throwing it back in the faces of those who fancy themselves his contemporaries. He doesn't pull any punches. Does not pull any punches. Everyone gets got here. Everyone gets got. And often in very, very unpleasant ways. Very unpleasant ways. But yeah, there's so much. There's just so much out there. I'm rereading On the Shoulders of OTAVA, which is Laura Mauro's novella, which is just beautiful. In fact, I will try my damnedest to get Laura on here to talk about that. Because Laura's great, and On the Shoulders of OTAVA is a beautiful, stunning piece of work. It is just, it's the kind of work that does it for me. You know, it's folkloric, it draws upon lots of Nordic mythology and folklore, but it weaves it into a postmodern setting and postmodern concerns, as her work tends to do. Those of you who have read her short story collection, Sing Your Sadness Deep, and if not, why not, by the way, go out there and get it, will know the quality of Laura's work. It is an absolute stunner. An absolute stunner. But yeah, I've got so many short story collections to read from so many publishers I like and respect, and so many writers that I like and respect. There's just tons of stuff. There's so much. And I urge you to go out there, my loves. Go forth and look for the small press stuff. Look for the independent presses. Look for the self-published stuff, you know? I know there's kind of like a snobbery against self-publication. And it's ironic because it often derives from people who are publishing shit. It's, you know, absolute awfulness. So yeah, I mean, all self-publication has really done is liberated publication. That's all it's done. It means that voices can be heard now that may not have been heard before, and that's kind of wonderful. It's kind of wonderful. So until next time, my loves, bye bye.